I always thought fear had a sound, like the rapid, uneven rhythm of your heartbeat echoing inside your skull, or the hiss of your own breath as you try to quiet it, to make yourself small enough to disappear. But in that cold, echoing warehouse, fear was silent, so heavy and thick it seemed to hang in the air, waiting for me to breathe it in. The concrete beneath my knees was slick with something I didn't want to identify. My wrists were bound behind me with a zip tie that had already carved angry welts into my skin, and the metallic taste of blood coated my tongue as if to remind me that defiance has a price. And I had just started paying it. They had dragged me in through the side door like I was a package that had gone astray, one man gripping my arm too tightly, another laughing under his breath when I stumbled. And though I wanted to curse them, to spit words sharp enough to cut through the thick air of male dominance and menace, my mouth refused to cooperate until I saw him. Lorenzo De Luca. Every whispered rumor, every grainy photograph, every story of bodies found in rivers or rivals disappearing into the night, all of it led to this man. He stood a few feet away, a dark figure under a single hanging light, his tailored suit absorbing the pale glow, his presence somehow louder than the silence. He wasn't the kind of beautiful that invited touch. He was the kind of beautiful that made you want to pray. His eyes, steel gray, cold as a gun barrel, lifted from the folder in his hand and met mine, and I swear the air shifted, as if the room itself recognized its ruler. "So," he said, his voice low, accented with that smooth Italian rhythm that made the simplest word sound like a secret. "You're the one who thought it was wise to spy on my operation." I wanted to look away. I didn't. "Spy?" I managed, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. Such a dramatic word. I prefer observe. One of the men behind me muttered a curse, his hand twitching toward me, but Lorenzo lifted a single finger, and the man froze. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know about him. Power didn't shout, it whispered. He took a slow step toward me, polished shoes gliding over the cracked floor. "Observe," he repeated, tasting the word like he was deciding whether to keep it or discard it. "And what did you observe, cara mia?" I should have been trembling. Instead, a strange calm spread through me, the kind that comes when you realize you're already past the point of rescue. "That the De Luca family doesn't like journalists," I said. Something flickered in his gaze, a spark of amusement, maybe disbelief. "You're a journalist?" "Investigative," I corrected, lifting my chin. "Elena Rossi. I write about corruption, and it looks like I just found the motherlode." He laughed softly, and the sound, low, dangerous, intimate, slid over my skin like silk dipped in poison. "You have a death wish, Miss Rossi." I shrugged as best I could with my hands bound. "Occupational hazard." He stopped in front of me, so close I could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated, the kind of scent that lingers long after the man is gone. His gaze dropped to the blood on my chin, then lower, to the floor where a few drops had splattered near his shoes. He looked down, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Then I did something incredibly stupid. I smiled up at him, met those sharp gray eyes, and said, "Guess I ruined your shoes." He tilted his head, studying me like one might study a strange animal that should have been afraid but wasn't. "You find this funny?" I swallowed, the metallic taste thick in my mouth. "No, I find you funny. You have all these men with guns, a warehouse straight out of a cliché, and you think tying me up will scare me. But I've met scarier men than you, Lorenzo." His name slipped out before I could stop it, and the reaction was immediate. A quiet shift in the air, like everyone in the room had stopped breathing. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. But it carried weight, the kind that pressed down on your chest, I don't remember giving you permission to use my name. Then maybe you should stop doing business in the shadows if you want to stay anonymous. His eyes narrowed, but that spark, amusement, interest, curiosity, flickered again. He crouched, bringing himself to my level, his hand resting casually on his knee, and for the first time I saw something unexpected in his face. Restraint. Not the kind born of politeness, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly how much destruction one could cause if one stopped holding back. You think because you write your little stories you understand men like me? He asked softly. I don't need to understand you, I whispered. I just need to expose you. He leaned closer until his breath brushed my cheek, warm and deliberate. You can't expose what owns the light, Bella Rebel. The darkness isn't hiding from you. It's waiting to see if you'll survive it. His words should have terrified me. They didn't. Maybe I was already too far gone. Maybe something in me, the reckless, grieving part, was drawn to his danger like a moth drawn to the promise of flame. And then, just as suddenly, he stood, motioning for his men to leave. They hesitated, but one look from him sent them filing out in silence, their footsteps fading until it was just the two of us, the hum of the single light and the heavy beat of my heart. He circled behind me, his voice low, thoughtful. You're not afraid. You should be. I'm tired of being afraid, I said. You lose people you love, and at some point fear just stops mattering. He paused, and I felt, rather than saw, the way he turned toward me. Who did you lose? I bit the inside of my cheek, until I tasted blood again. Someone you wouldn't remember. But I do. Every single day. Silence stretched between us, thick and tense, until I heard the sharp sound of a knife slicing through air. The pressure on my wrists vanished. I turned, flexing my hands, staring at the zip tie now lying at my feet. Go home, Elena Rossi, he said, his voice almost gentle. Before curiosity gets you killed. I rose slowly, every muscle trembling from a cocktail of adrenaline and disbelief. Why let me go? He smiled then, not the kind that warms, but the kind that chills. Because I want to see what you'll do next. And then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there at all, leaving me standing in that empty warehouse with blood drying on my skin and a single thought clawing its way through my mind. He should have killed me. Because now I knew his face, his name, and the truth. He was not a monster hiding in the dark. He was a man who believed he was the dark. And I wasn't done with him yet. When I walked out of that warehouse, the night felt heavier than it ever had before. The kind of darkness that clings to your skin and seeps into your lungs. A living, breathing thing that knows your name and won't forget your scent. The city was quiet. Too quiet. And as I stumbled onto the cracked asphalt of the empty street, my mind was still reeling, replaying every second of the encounter, every word, every look, every moment of deliberate control that man had wielded like a weapon wrapped in silk. I told myself I should run, disappear, cross a border, change my name, burn my notes, pretend I never went looking for him. But of course I didn't. I never do the things that make sense. The cab driver didn't ask questions when I slid into the back seat, though he kept glancing at me through the mirror like I was a ghost or a problem he wanted to forget. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching the city lights smear into streaks of gold and red, and all I could think about was his voice, that low, dangerous calm that seemed to echo even when he wasn't there. That promise of violence tempered with something far worse. Curiosity. He had let me go not because he pitied me, but because I had become interesting. When I reached my apartment, the place felt smaller than usual, suffocating in its familiarity, the walls closing in with their faded paint and faint smell of stale coffee and ink. My notes were spread across the table, photographs of men in suits, blurred images of guns being traded near docks, ledgers filled with numbers I had half deciphered, and at the center of it all, a picture of my brother, Matteo, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since before everything fell apart. I sat there for a long time, just staring at his face, trying to remember the sound of his laugh, the way he used to ruffle my hair and call me Lenina when he wanted to annoy me, and then the way his eyes had gone cold the day he told me he was in trouble. He had disappeared 3 days later. The police had called it a random attack, a robbery gone wrong, but I had seen the reports, the unspoken details, the way the case had been quietly buried, and I had known then, with a kind of clarity that could slice bone, that it had been something darker, something organized, something that led to them. So, no, I wasn't done. I poured myself a drink, the kind that burned enough to make me feel alive again, and started typing, documenting everything that had happened in that warehouse, every word Lorenzo De Luca had said, every glance that had felt like a scalpel. I told myself it was for the story, that I was doing this because I needed proof, because I wanted to expose him. But somewhere deep down, beneath all that righteous fury, there was something else. A pull, magnetic and unwanted. The kind that doesn't ask permission before it consumes you. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on the investigation. I traced shipments connected to De Luca's companies, followed paper trails that curved back on themselves like snakes eating their tails. And every time I thought I was close to something real, it vanished, erased by someone with far more power and precision than I had. But that didn't stop me. If anything, it made me hungrier, more reckless. Then came the invitation. It arrived in the form of a sleek black envelope slipped under my door, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a spy movie, embossed with nothing but a single silver crest, the De Luca family sigil. My stomach turned over when I opened it, my fingers trembling despite my best efforts to appear composed, and inside was a single line written in elegant handwriting that looked almost old-fashioned. You owe me a dance. No name, no address. Just a date, a time, and the quiet understanding that refusing wasn't really an option. For a long time I sat there staring at it, my mind running through every possible meaning, every possible trap, and yet underneath all the rational warnings screaming in my head was a whisper, low and traitorous, you want to see him again. When the night came, I dressed carefully, not for him, I told myself, but for the game. The red dress was a statement, bold, unapologetic, impossible to ignore. My reflection in the mirror looked like someone I barely recognized, dangerous, deliberate, the kind of woman who might survive a dance with the devil. The gala was held at the Mirabella Hotel, the kind of place where wealth has its own gravity, where everyone moves like they're being watched, and the champagne flows just fast enough to keep the whispers lubricated. I could feel eyes on me the moment I entered. Men in tuxedos and women draped in diamonds glancing over with that subtle curiosity that comes when someone doesn't quite fit. I pretended not to notice, scanning the room for him, though I already knew I wouldn't have to look far. Men like Lorenzo don't enter rooms, they command them. And there he was, standing near the balcony, talking to a man who looked terrified to even breathe wrong. He turned his head slightly, as if he had sensed me before he saw me, and our eyes met across the crowd. The noise of the room faded, the air shifted, and for a brief, dizzying second, I forgot every reason I had to hate him. He crossed the room with that effortless grace that comes from owning the ground you walk on, stopping just close enough that I could smell that same faint cologne from the warehouse. Dark, sharp, intoxicating. You came, he said, and it wasn't a question. I was curious, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Besides, you said I owed you a dance. His mouth curved, slow and deliberate. I did. When his hand found mine, the contact was electric, not gentle, not rough, but certain. And as he led me onto the dance floor, I realized he was giving me the illusion of control even as he guided every step. The music was slow, old world, the kind of melody that makes your heart beat out of sync with reason. And as we moved, I felt the line between us blur. The hunter and the hunted, the liar and the truth seeker. The man who should have been my enemy and the one who somehow already knew too much about me. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured near my ear, his voice so close I could feel it vibrate through me. "Then why invite me?" He smiled, and the look in his eyes made my stomach twist. "Because I wanted to see if you'd dare." And there it was again. That game, that dangerous fascination that neither of us was pretending to hide anymore. When the song ended, he didn't let go immediately. His fingers lingered on my wrist, tracing the faint scar left by the zip tie, and for a moment his expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "You keep walking into danger, Elena. One day it's not going to let you walk out. Maybe I'm tired of walking away." He studied me, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. "Then I hope you're ready, Bella Rebelle, because next time, the devil won't let you go so easily." And before I could speak, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd, leaving me standing in the middle of that glittering ballroom with my pulse hammering, my mind spinning, and one truth burning through the fog. I wasn't just chasing a story anymore. I was chasing him. Sleep didn't come that night. Not in any way that could be called peaceful, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw him again. The way his fingers had lingered at my wrist. The way his voice had brushed against my skin like a secret meant to be whispered only once. The way his gaze had followed me through that crowded ballroom even after he disappeared, as if he had marked me somehow. Not with possession, but with curiosity. And that, I realized with a kind of slow, horrifying clarity, was far more dangerous. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, tracing invisible patterns in the dark, listening to the city outside breathing in restless rhythm, sirens in the distance, the low growl of a motorcycle somewhere below, the occasional shout that echoed off the buildings like a warning. And I told myself over and over again that what I felt wasn't attraction, that it wasn't fascination, that it was simply fear, that my pulse raced not because of him, but because I was still tangled in something I didn't understand, something that had already swallowed people stronger than me. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. Lorenzo De Luca had become a question I couldn't stop asking, a shadow I couldn't stop following, and I hated myself for it. By morning, the mirror offered no sympathy. My reflection looked like someone halfway between exhaustion and obsession. Hair a mess, eyes rimmed with the kind of darkness that sleep deprivation paints. But underneath all that, there was something else, something alive. It terrified me to realize how much I needed to see him again, to understand the contradiction that lived behind that calm, unreadable mask he wore like a second skin. I spent the next few days trying to pretend I wasn't waiting. I buried myself in research, in tracing the web of companies, shell fronts, and charitable foundations that stretched like veins through the De Luca empire. The deeper I dug, the more I found that the man who had once ruled his city through fear and silence was now trying, in some strange and inexplicable way, to make his darkness look legitimate. There were hospitals under his name, art foundations, youth programs in neighborhoods that used to belong to his enemies. And though I knew it couldn't be clean, I also couldn't prove the dirt. He was rewriting his story, piece by piece, and I wanted to know why. I told myself this was for the article, that I was doing what any journalist would, following the story to its center. But there was a part of me that had stopped caring about headlines or bylines or the truth that could be printed in black and white. I wanted him. I wanted to know what kind of man could make the world kneel with one hand and then touch a woman's wrist as though afraid she might break. 3 days after the gala, I found the note. It was tucked between the pages of the ledger I'd stolen a photograph of months earlier, and I still don't know how it got there. Whether it had been placed by one of his men or by Lorenzo himself. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Elegant, deliberate, sharp at the edges like his voice. Curiosity is a blade, Elena. Keep playing with it and you'll bleed. No signature, no threat, but none was needed. The note felt like both a warning and an invitation. That night I couldn't stay inside. The air in my apartment felt too still, too full of ghosts and questions, so I walked, letting the city swallow me whole. The neon lights smearing against the fog. The sound of my heels on wet pavement, a heartbeat I could control when everything else was slipping through my fingers. I ended up near the river, where the air smelled like rust and salt, and where the old warehouses loomed like sleeping beasts. I didn't know what I was looking for until I saw the car. It was parked near the end of the pier, black, gleaming, out of place in a part of town where things rusted before they even finished being built. And when the door opened, when I saw him step out, dressed not in the expensive perfection of a tailored suit, but in something far more disarming. Dark slacks, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the faintest trace of exhaustion shadowing his face. I forgot, for one foolish heartbeat, to be afraid. He looked at me like he had known I'd come. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, no menace in his tone this time, just something low and resigned, as if the universe had already written this moment and he was too tired to fight it. "I could say the same to you," I answered, stepping closer, the sound of my boots echoing against the water. "What are you doing here?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Some ghosts prefer the river. They like the way it hides things." I folded my arms, ignoring the chill that crept up my spine. "You mean bodies?" His gaze met mine, steady and unflinching. "Among other things." There was a pause then, the kind that stretches too long, full of words neither of you are brave enough to say. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. "Why do you keep following me, Elena?" I wanted to lie, to tell him it was for justice, for truth, for my brother. But the words caught in my throat. "Because I need to know who you are," I said instead, and it came out quieter than I meant it to. He stepped closer, the air between us charged, thick with something unnamed. "And what if you find out I'm exactly what they say I am?" "Then at least I'll know," I whispered. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small lighter, and flicked it open, the flame dancing between us, soft and dangerous. He held it out toward me, and for a heartbeat I thought he meant to burn the note I hadn't realized I was still holding. But instead he said, "You think you understand fire because you've seen it, but you don't know it until you let it touch you." I stared at the flickering light, feeling its warmth on my face, and before I could stop myself, I said, "Then show me." Something changed in his eyes, a flicker of surprise, maybe admiration, maybe something darker. He closed the lighter, the flame dying between us, and when he spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "Careful, Bella Rebel. You don't ask the devil for lessons in fire unless you're ready to burn." Then he brushed past me, his shoulder grazing mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me so sharp I nearly turned to follow him. But when I did, he was already gone, swallowed again by the dark, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and something I couldn't name. I stood there for a long time, staring at the black river, feeling the note in my hand crumple as the rain began to fall, and I knew, with a kind of resigned clarity, that whatever line had once separated me from his world had just dissolved, and that I wasn't chasing a story anymore. I was falling into one. When I got home, there was an email waiting for me, No sender, no subject, just a single sentence. You have 3 days to decide which side you're on. And attached was a photo. My brother, alive, or at least he had been when it was taken. The photograph haunted me. It wasn't just that it showed my brother alive, or at least not dead yet, but that it had been taken somewhere I couldn't place. A dimly lit room with bare concrete walls and a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The kind of place where hope goes to die quietly. His face was thinner, older. The smile I remembered replaced with a wary, uncertain expression. But it was him, no doubt. And seeing it felt like being torn open from the inside, every wall I'd built around my grief collapsing under the weight of that single image. I stared at it for what must have been hours, my hands trembling, my mind spiraling through every possible scenario, until the words in the email burned themselves into my thoughts like a curse. You have 3 days to decide which side you're on. I didn't sleep. How could I, knowing that somewhere out there my brother might be breathing, suffering, waiting? The city outside my window pulsed like a heartbeat I couldn't sync with, neon light bleeding into the darkness, every shadow whispering his name. And beneath that, under the noise of the streets and the hum of my own frantic thoughts, was the quiet certainty that Lorenzo had orchestrated this, that he had known exactly what to send, when to send it, how to make me desperate enough to come to him. By morning, I had convinced myself I wouldn't go. I told myself it was a trap, that he was playing me, that the photograph was either old or staged or both, that he wanted control, not truth. I told myself all the logical things a sane woman would say. But the thing about logic is that it loses its strength when hope walks into the room, even dressed in the devil's colors. So when the black car appeared outside my apartment just before midnight, idling like a patient predator, I didn't fight it. I walked down the stairs with my coat wrapped tightly around me, my heart a drumbeat of defiance and surrender tangled into one, and when the driver, a man with the kind of expression that belongs to someone who's seen too much, opened the door for me, I stepped inside without a word. The city slipped away in silence, buildings melting into shadows, until we were far from anything familiar. When the car finally stopped, I saw the estate. It was nothing like the stories had painted. The DeLuca mansion didn't look like a fortress. It looked like a cathedral built for sins too exquisite to confess. Iron gates framed by old stone, gardens that glowed faintly under the moonlight, the scent of jasmine mixing with the faint trace of smoke and rain. The kind of beauty that hurts to look at for too long. The door opened before I could knock, and there he was. Lorenzo stood at the top of the stairs, dressed in black as always, though without the armor of his suit jacket this time. Sleeves rolled, collar open just enough to reveal a line of skin, and the glint of a chain at his throat. The air between us felt alive, charged. A living thing that pulsed with all the words we hadn't said yet. "You came," he said, his tone unreadable, somewhere between satisfaction and something softer. "You didn't leave me much of a choice," I replied, trying to sound steadier than I felt. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once, as if acknowledging a move made correctly in a game I didn't know the rules of. "Follow me." Inside, the house was a contradiction. Luxury and violence woven together so seamlessly, it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Marble floors, old paintings, the faint hum of classical music drifting from somewhere unseen, but beneath it all, a tension, an awareness that everything here existed on the edge of something dangerous. He led me into a room that looked more like a library than an office, lined with books that probably hadn't been opened in years. A decanter of whiskey sat on the desk, the amber liquid catching the light. He poured 2 glasses, handed me one without asking if I wanted it, then took a slow sip of his own. "Tell me what you saw," he said. "You know what I saw," I answered, my voice sharper than intended. His eyes flicked up to mine, steady, unblinking. "I want to hear you say it." I took a breath, the glass shaking slightly in my hand. My brother, Matteo, alive. Something passed over his face. Something quick, too subtle to name. And what do you want from me, Elena? I want you to tell me where he is. He set his drink down, the sound of crystal meeting wood echoing louder than it should have. You think I took him? I think you know what happened to him, I said, stepping closer, my voice trembling with anger I'd buried too long. You were there when your men dragged me into that warehouse? And you expect me to believe you don't know where my brother is? You're the one pulling every string in this city. He tilted his head, watching me with that quiet, infuriating calm that made me want to scream. You give me too much credit, Bella Rebel. Don't call me that, I snapped. He smiled faintly. Why not? It suits you. You've been fighting ghosts your whole life. I can see it in your eyes. I wanted to hate him, but the way he said it, the quiet understanding beneath the words, hit something raw inside me. I turned away before he could see it. If you didn't send that photo, who did? Someone who wants to hurt you, he said simply. And me. I looked back at him, startled. What do you mean? He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the faint scar near his jaw, the shadow of stubble that made him look less like a myth and more like a man. The war you've stumbled into isn't about you, Elena. It's about power, about loyalty, about what people will do to those who don't choose sides fast enough. Then tell me which side you're on. He smiled again, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was almost sad. Mine. For a moment, everything stopped. The air, the music, even the hum of my thoughts. He reached into his pocket, pulled out something small and placed it in my hand. A phone. Sleek, black, untraceable. If you want to find your brother, he said quietly, you'll need to start listening to me. Every instruction, every word. No questions, no second guessing. You follow my lead and maybe, you'll survive this. And if I don't? He stepped closer, his breath brushing my ear when he spoke. Then you'll die before you ever find out what really happened to Matteo. I swallowed hard, the room spinning slightly. Not from fear, but from the unbearable proximity of him. The way his presence filled every corner. The way he looked at me as if I were something fragile he wanted to destroy and protect all at once. He pulled back just enough to meet my eyes again. Dinner is at 8. Wear something that tells the world you're not afraid of the devil. Then he turned and left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me alone with the phone still warm in my hand. The weight of his words heavy in my chest, and the sinking realization that I had just crossed the point of no return. Because whatever game this was, whatever truth he was hiding, I wasn't just a player anymore. I was his move. There's something about silence in a place like that house. How it doesn't feel empty but alive. How every corner seems to breathe softly, waiting for you to make a mistake. How even the air carries a pulse that isn't your own. And as I stood in front of the mirror that evening, staring at the stranger reflected back at me, I realized that the silence inside me had started to sound exactly like his voice. The dress he'd sent fit too perfectly to be coincidence. Black silk that moved like smoke over skin, cut just low enough to be a question, not an answer. The kind of thing that said, I'm not afraid of you even when every heartbeat contradicted the lie. The phone he'd given me buzzed once, a simple message. Downstairs. Nothing else. No punctuation, no warmth, no threat, just command wrapped in simplicity. And still it made my stomach twist, not from fear this time, but from something far less rational. Anticipation, curiosity, the kind of dangerous hunger that grows in the spaces between what you should do and what you secretly want to. The dining room looked like a scene from another century. Long table, candlelight flickering across dark wood, crystal glasses catching slivers of gold from the fire burning in the hearth. Lorenzo stood at the far end, a shadow turned to flesh, his posture as calm as ever, though his eyes carried that same sharpness I'd come to recognize, the one that seemed to see everything I didn't say. He didn't greet me. He didn't have to. The faint curve of his mouth when his gaze met mine said enough. "Wine?" he asked, his tone too casual, too soft. And when I nodded, he poured, the red liquid flowing like spilled velvet between us. I sat across from him, pretending I didn't notice how his gaze lingered. Not indecently, not cruelly, but with the kind of interest that makes you feel both seen and dissected. "You've been quiet," he said finally, cutting into the silence. "Maybe I've run out of questions," I replied, though we both knew it was a lie. He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "No, Elena. You've just learned that some answers cost more than you're ready to pay." I set my glass down, my fingers trembling despite my best efforts to hide it. "Then why bring me here? Why show me all of this?" He leaned back in his chair, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if he enjoyed watching me try to find balance in a world he controlled. "Because you keep pretending you're not part of it," he said. "You want truth, but you forget that truth doesn't live in clean places." "I can handle dirt," I shot back. He smiled faintly, but his eyes darkened. "Can you handle blood?" The question hung in the air, heavy, intimate, and something about the way he said it, so calm, so certain, made me think he already knew the answer. "I've already seen it," I whispered. He set down his fork, his expression unreadable. "Then you know it never really washes off." For a moment, the only sound was the soft crackle of fire, the faint chime of glass when I lifted the wine again to my lips. I watched him, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he filled the space without effort. And I wondered who he'd been before all this, before power and fear became his second skin. "Tell me about my brother," I said, my voice quieter now, not an accusation this time, but something closer to pleading. "You said this isn't just about me, then what is it?" He didn't answer right away, and in that silence I saw something flicker across his face, a shadow of regret, maybe pain, maybe something deeper. "Matteo was working for someone he shouldn't have trusted," he said finally. "He got caught between two sides of a war that wasn't his to fight." I felt the words hit me, dull and heavy, like a bruise forming beneath skin. "And you?" I asked. "Which side were you on?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and when he spoke, his voice was almost tender. "The one that keeps you alive." I wanted to believe him. God help me, I wanted to. But wanting and trusting are not the same thing. And I'd learned too late that sometimes love and betrayal are carved from the same wood. He rose from the table, walking slowly toward me, each step unhurried, deliberate. And when he stopped beside my chair, the air changed. I could feel him before he touched me. The heat of him. The gravity that seemed to pull everything in the room toward him. "You think I'm your enemy," he said softly. And though his words should have sounded like a warning, they didn't. They sounded like a confession. "But if I wanted you gone, you wouldn't be sitting here." "Then what do you want?" I whispered. His hand lifted, slow, careful, until his fingers brushed a strand of hair from my face. The touch barely there, but enough to make every nerve in my body wake at once. "The truth," he said. And though I wanted to ask whose truth, mine or his, I couldn't find the words. He moved closer, and I should have stepped back. I should have pulled away. I should have remembered every reason to hate him. But when his breath touched my skin, when his eyes met mine and stayed there, I forgot everything except the sound of my own pulse. "This is a mistake," I said, though the words came out more like a prayer than a protest. He smiled, faintly, that infuriating, devastating smile that made it impossible to tell whether he was mocking me or saving me. "Probably," he murmured, "but some mistakes are worth repeating." His lips brushed my cheek. Not quite a kiss, not yet. More like a promise or a threat or something in between. And then he stepped back, leaving the air cold where he'd been. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice back to its usual composure, though something behind it trembled, almost imperceptibly. "You'll come with me. There's someone you need to meet." "Who?" He didn't answer. He simply turned, poured another glass of wine, and said over his shoulder, "You wanted to know what your brother died for, Bella Rebel. I'm going to show you what men kill for." And then he walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart still trying to remember how to beat properly, my mind reeling with questions that felt too dangerous to ask, and one single, unshakable realization clawing its way through the noise. Whatever I was becoming, whatever I was stepping into, it wasn't just about truth anymore. It was about him. And I couldn't tell if I was being pulled closer to salvation or dragged straight to hell. The next morning came softly. Too softly. As if the world itself had decided to conspire in silence, letting the walls breathe and the air settle in that deceptive calm that comes before a storm. And I remember lying there, half awake, half trapped inside the tangle of my dreams where his voice lingered like smoke, where his eyes followed me even when I tried not to look. The room they'd given me was too beautiful for comfort, the kind of luxury that made you feel exposed rather than safe. Cream walls, a chandelier that dripped light like melted gold, windows that opened onto a garden so perfectly manicured it felt like artifice. It was a room that whispered belonging while reminding you you didn't. I told myself I wasn't a prisoner. After all, no one had locked the door. There were no guards stationed inside, no threats made, no chains. But freedom, I was beginning to learn, wasn't measured in doors or keys. It was measured in the weight of someone else's will. And Lorenzo's will filled every corner of that house like a scent that refused to fade. When the maid, her name was Sophia, soft-spoken, eyes downcast but watchful in that quiet way people are when they know things you don't, brought me breakfast, she said only, "Mr. DeLuca will see you in an hour." No explanation, no question, just a statement delivered with the politeness of habit, the kind that carries its own warning. I wanted to ask her if she was afraid of him, if she had ever seen him lose control, if she knew what it was like to be looked at by him as though your soul had become a mirror. But her expression told me that silence was her armor, and I had already lost too many of my own. When I finally found him, he was standing by one of the tall windows in his study, his back to me, hands clasped loosely behind him, the morning light cutting through the glass and gilding the edges of his figure. There was something unsettlingly peaceful about the way he stood there, like a man completely at home inside his own darkness. "You sleep well?" he asked, without turning, his tone neither kind nor cold, just steady, deliberate. "I slept," I said, because admitting that I had dreamed of him would have been too much, even for me. He glanced over his shoulder, the faintest hint of amusement crossing his face. "That's something." "I didn't have a choice about being here, did I?" I asked, stepping closer. "You always have a choice, Elena," he replied, turning fully now, his eyes meeting mine. "But choices are like knives. They cut both ways." It was such a Lorenzo thing to say, poetic and merciless all at once, and I hated that part of me found it beautiful. He gestured toward the table beside him, where a folder lay open. "I want to show you something." I hesitated before crossing the room, aware of the way his gaze followed me. Not with hunger exactly, but with a kind of possession that was quieter and far more dangerous. When I reached the table, I looked down, and my breath caught. Inside the folder were photographs, not of violence this time, but of people. Children, women, men, all from the same neighborhood on the South Side, one I'd written about months ago in an exposé on political neglect. There were notes, donation receipts, lists of names underlined in his handwriting. "What is this?" I asked, confused. Investment, he said. In the kind of future the city pretends to want but never builds. I frowned, flipping through the papers. You're funding hospitals, shelters. These are legitimate projects. They're also the only leverage I have, he said, his voice softer now, almost weary. For every lawmaker that takes my money, another uses my name to buy silence. I clean the streets because it buys me peace. But peace, Bella Rebel, is expensive. The contradiction in him, the brutality I knew he was capable of, the almost aching humanity in his confession, made something twist deep inside me. Why are you showing me this? Because you're still trying to decide who I am, he said simply. And I'd rather you make that decision with your eyes open. For a moment I couldn't speak. The room felt smaller, closer, the air charged with too many truths pressing at once. Finally I said, "You talk like you're saving the city." "I talk like a man who knows he can't be saved," he corrected. There was such raw honesty in that sentence that it hollowed me out. I wanted to ask him if he ever regretted it all, the power, the blood, the weight of being feared. But something in his face told me he had learned to live with regret the same way others live with pain. Quietly. Constantly. Without expectation of mercy. He took a step closer, and I realized that for all his control, for all his precision, there was a restlessness in him too. Something restless and unguarded that he kept hidden behind that polished calm. "I know what you think of me," he said, "but there are things in motion you don't understand yet. Your brother stumbled into them. That's why he's gone." My heart thudded painfully at the sound of Mateo's name. "Then tell me everything." He studied me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. You're not ready for that truth." "Don't decide that for me," I snapped, anger flaring before I could stop it. His gaze darkened, but not with fury, with something heavier, deeper. "If I told you now, Elena, you'd run, and you wouldn't make it to the gate." He moved closer again, and suddenly I could feel his presence like heat. My body caught between instinct and surrender. "I'm not your prisoner," I whispered, though the words came out weaker than I intended. "No," he said softly, his hand lifting just slightly, almost touching me, almost. "You're my guest. But a guest who doesn't know which doors are safe to open." It wasn't a threat. Not really. It was a confession disguised as a warning. He stepped back before I could speak, breaking whatever spell had settled between us. "Come with me," he said. He led me through, the hallway, down a flight of stairs, into a part of the house that felt older, colder, quieter. At the end of the corridor was a steel door, out of place among the marble and gold, and when he unlocked it, the air changed, thicker, charged, carrying the scent of dust and oil. Inside was a room full of files, maps, photographs pinned to walls in a chaos that didn't match Lorenzo's usual precision. "This is the war," he said simply. "Every rival, every threat, every deal that decides who dies and who gets to keep pretending they're untouchable." He pointed to one photo, my brother's face, circled in red ink. "He worked for someone I trusted once," he said. "But trust is another kind of currency here. It always runs out." I stared at the picture, the lines connecting his name to others I didn't recognize, the map of deceit that seemed to stretch infinitely. "And me?" I asked quietly. "What am I in this?" He turned to me, his expression unreadable. A variable I didn't plan for. It should have sounded like an insult. Instead, it felt like the most honest thing he'd ever said. When he left me there, standing in front of that wall of secrets, I realized that I wasn't trapped, because he held me here. I was trapped because I wanted to stay. Because part of me believed that somewhere inside this labyrinth of power, and guilt, and blood, there was a truth that might save us both. But as the door closed softly behind him, The echo lingered like a promise and a warning in one. The cage may have been made of silk, but it was still a cage. And the longer I stayed inside it, the harder it would be to remember the way out. There are moments when the truth doesn't arrive like thunder or lightning or revelation, but like a whisper that slides quietly under the door when you aren't looking. And by the time you realize it's entered the room, it's already sitting beside you, breathing in rhythm with your heartbeat. That's how it began, the unraveling. It wasn't one event, one confrontation, one scream that split the world open. It was the slow, steady drip of understanding that turned everything I thought I knew into ash. The days after Lorenzo showed me the war room blurred together, time twisting into something unmeasurable, the sun and moon changing places without permission while I wandered through the corridors of his mansion, like someone searching for exits that didn't exist. I had become part of his rhythm, meals at his table, glances across rooms that felt like invisible wires binding us tighter, quiet mornings where he'd read while I pretended not to watch him. The strange part was how natural it began to feel. This proximity to danger. This constant awareness of being both protected and imprisoned. I tried to remind myself why I was there, to find my brother, to uncover what had really happened. But somewhere between the silence of his study and the sound of his voice in the dark, I began to lose the edges of my anger, and that terrified me more than anything. Because once anger fades, something else always takes its place. And in this house, that something was far more dangerous. It was near midnight when I found the door. I wasn't looking for it, not really. I'd been wandering again, unable to sleep, drawn by the hum of the rain against the windows and the faint music playing somewhere distant. The hallway was darker here, the air colder, and the heavy oak door seemed almost alive, as if it had been waiting. Inside, the light was low, a single lamp casting its glow across a desk cluttered with papers, maps, a half-empty glass of whiskey, and a small black notebook bound in leather. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Lorenzo's, elegant but sharp, the kind of script that looked like it had been carved rather than written. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed no. But curiosity is a kind of hunger, and mine had already devoured too much to stop now. The first few pages were numbers, shipments, coded entries I didn't understand. But then, halfway through, the words changed. Names, dates, transactions that linked back to organizations I'd seen in my brother's notes. And then there it was. Matteo Rossi. My throat tightened as I read, my eyes catching on the words that followed. Eliminated, internal order, confirmed by M. Cerici. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Matteo hadn't been caught between sides. He hadn't been a casualty of someone else's war. He'd been executed, on Lorenzo's watch, by one of his men. My first thought was denial. He didn't know. It couldn't be real. Someone else had written it. But the more I stared at those words, the more they felt like truth, cruel and cold and final. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. I shoved the notebook closed, my pulse hammering in my ears, and stumbled back into the hall, trying to remember how to breathe. That's when I saw him. Matteo. Not my brother. Lorenzo's Matteo. His right-hand man. The one who stood behind him during every meeting. The one who watched me with eyes that never blinked. He was leaning against the wall as if he'd been waiting for me, his expression unreadable, though there was something almost amused in the curve of his mouth. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly, his voice carrying that lazy confidence that always felt like a knife wrapped in velvet. I froze, my fingers still trembling around the edge of the notebook I hadn't realized I was still holding. He stepped closer, his eyes flicking down to the notebook, and the faint smile vanished. "You shouldn't have opened that." The air between us changed instantly, the way it does right before a storm breaks, and I felt it then. the danger that had always lingered at the edges of this place suddenly rushing forward, sharp and tangible. "Tell me what this means," I said, my voice breaking despite my best effort to steady it. "Tell me what you did." Matteo sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You weren't supposed to see that. Did you kill him?" The words ripped out of me before I could stop them. He didn't answer, and that silence was all I needed. My vision blurred. My brother's face flashed behind my eyes, the boy who used to steal my notebooks to doodle in the margins, the man who had promised he'd fix everything before he vanished. And now, standing here, I was staring at the man who had taken that from me. I lunged at him, stupidly, blindly, the kind of movement that isn't bravery but grief wearing its fiercest disguise. He caught me easily, his grip hard but not cruel. "Don't make me hurt you," he said, and for a split second I saw regret flicker in his expression. "Lorenzo doesn't know," I hissed. "Does he?" Matteo hesitated. "He gave the order," he said quietly. "He just didn't know what it would cost him." And that was it. That was the knife that twisted deeper than any bullet could. He hadn't known. He'd ordered it anyway? The man who had promised to protect me, who had looked at me like I was something he couldn't destroy, had already destroyed the only thing that mattered to me before I ever stepped into his world. The rage that surged up inside me then didn't feel human. It felt ancient, raw, made of every scream I'd swallowed since the night I lost Matteo. But before I could say another word, before I could even think what to do next, the door at the end of the corridor burst open. Lorenzo stood there, framed by the light spilling from the study behind him, his expression unreadable except for the coldness in his eyes. "What are you doing?" His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that precedes violence. Matteo dropped my arm, taking a step back. "She knows," he said simply. Something flickered in Lorenzo's gaze. A fracture, a shadow of disbelief. And then, in a motion so fast it barely made sense, he drew his gun. The shot shattered the silence. Matteo's body hit the floor with a sound I'll never forget. Heavy and final, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the iron tang of blood almost instantly. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I'd just seen. Lorenzo stood there, the gun still smoking in his hand, his chest rising and falling too quickly, his jaw clenched. Then he looked at me, and the expression in his eyes was something between devastation and resignation. "He killed your brother," he said softly, as if saying it could make it less terrible, as if the truth could somehow absolve him. I didn't know until tonight. I wanted to scream at him, hit him, break every piece of him until he hurt the way I did. But instead I just stood there, shaking, staring at the man who had just killed his most loyal soldier to prove something I couldn't yet understand. The silence that followed felt infinite. Finally, he dropped the gun, his voice barely audible. "Now you know why I said some truths cost too much." He took a step toward me, but I backed away, every nerve screaming at once, my heart caught somewhere between rage and something worse. Grief, love, confusion, all twisted together until I couldn't tell them apart. I looked down at Matteo's body, then back at him and whispered, "You're still lying to me." He didn't deny it. And as I turned and walked away, my hands still trembling, I knew that whatever came next would destroy one of us completely. The first thing I remember after the gunshot was the silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that hangs heavy over ruin. That terrible stillness that makes the air thick and the heart too loud. The kind that follows every act of irreversible violence, where you realize that something has shifted in the world, and there is no way to return to the moment before it happened. The echo of the shot seemed to linger inside my body, vibrating in my bones, and when I looked at Lorenzo, really looked at him, I saw not the man who had once held me captive with nothing more than a gaze, but someone hollowed out by his own choices, a king standing over the pieces of a throne built from ghosts. He didn't move at first. His hand still trembled around the gun, his eyes locked on the lifeless body of Matteo, the man who had been his shadow, his brother in all but blood, the one he had trusted most, and I could see it. The fracture that would never heal, the betrayal that cut both ways. Then slowly, with a motion that seemed to cost him everything, he lowered the weapon and turned to me. And in that instant, I realized that whatever held us together was no longer built on curiosity, or desire, or danger. It was built on destruction. "Go upstairs," he said quietly, his voice stripped bare of command, so soft I almost didn't hear it. "No," I said, the word sharp and trembling, more instinct than decision. He looked at me then, his eyes dark and unreadable, and for a moment I thought he might yell, might order, might remind me who he was, but instead he just whispered, "Please." That single word, spoken by a man who never begged for anything, broke something inside me. I turned and walked away, my hands still shaking, my breath uneven, the sound of my heartbeat drowning out everything else. But I didn't go far. I couldn't. Something in me needed to know what came next, needed to understand whether what I'd seen was justice or vengeance or something far worse. From the balcony outside the study, I watched as two of his men came to remove Matteo's body. Their movements mechanical, practiced, the quiet reverence of soldiers who had done this too many times before. Lorenzo said nothing, didn't look at them, just stared at the blood spreading slowly across the marble floor. And I thought then that maybe he was bleeding too, just in a way no one could see. When he finally came upstairs hours later, dawn was just beginning to brush the sky with color, and I was sitting by the window, still in the same black dress, still trying to convince myself that I hadn't completely lost control of who I was. He stood in the doorway for a long time, silent, until the light touched his face, and I saw the exhaustion etched there, the weight of what he'd done pressing down on him like a crown made of lead. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice rough, cracked in a way I'd never heard before. "I swear to you, Elena, I didn't know he was the one who killed your brother." "I want to believe you," I whispered, staring at the sunrise that looked too beautiful for such a morning. "But I don't know if I can." He walked closer, his footsteps slow, careful, as though approaching something fragile that might shatter if touched too suddenly. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said. "Not your brother, not Matteo, not you." The last words hung between us, heavier than all the rest. I turned to look at him, and for the first time I saw not the monster the world feared, not the untouchable mafia boss, but a man unraveling, torn between the blood he'd spilled and the woman standing in front of him demanding to know why. "What happens now?" I asked. He exhaled slowly, rubbed his hands over his face, and said, "Now, we clean the mess. Matteo wasn't working alone. The other families will see this as weakness, and weakness gets you killed in my world." "So it's starting," I said quietly. He nodded. "It's already started." The next few days moved like a fever dream. The house became a hive of quiet chaos, men coming and going, voices raised in tense conversations behind closed doors, the constant hum of phones and footsteps, and the smell of gun oil and cigarette smoke. I wasn't supposed to be part of it, but Lorenzo stopped pretending that I wasn't already tangled in his web. He told me things now. Not everything, never everything, but enough to make me realize how deep this world ran, how loyalty and betrayal danced so close they were indistinguishable until the blade was already in your back. I started helping, almost without realizing it. Small things at first. Decoding files, reading messages, connecting dots he didn't have time to see. and though I knew I should have felt repulsed by the blood that trailed behind every decision, part of me felt something else. Useful. Alive. Necessary. One night, long after everyone else had gone, we found ourselves alone again in the study, the fire burning low, casting shadows across his face. He was sitting at the desk, his jacket off, sleeves rolled, the veins in his forearms visible as he leaned forward, studying a map spread before him. I stood behind him, close enough to see the small scar near his temple, close enough to smell the faint mix of smoke and whiskey on his skin. "Why do you keep me here?" I asked softly. "Is it guilt? Or strategy?" He didn't look up. Neither. Then what? This time he did look up, and the expression in his eyes made my breath catch. Because when you're near me, I remember I still have something to lose. I didn't move, couldn't move, because the way he said it wasn't romantic. It was raw, almost painful, like an admission dragged out of him against his will. And before I could stop myself, I reached out, my hand brushing his shoulder, and for a heartbeat the world held still. He turned his head slightly, his breath touching the inside of my wrist, and it was enough to make everything in me unravel. When he stood, I should have stepped back, should have rebuilt the walls I'd let crumble, but instead, I let him close the space between us until there was no distance left to save. "You don't have to do this," I whispered, though neither of us believed it. He smiled faintly, that same half-broken smile I'd come to dread and crave. "I already am." His lips found mine, slow at first, hesitant, as if he was testing the weight of a sin before committing to it, and then deeper, rougher, until every thought, every fear, every reason to run was drowned in the fire that had been smoldering between us since the first moment I defied him. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't kind. It was desperate and consuming, and filled with everything we couldn't say out loud. The grief, the guilt, the rage, the love neither of us should have felt but did anyway. And when he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, the silence between us was louder than any confession. "This changes nothing," he said softly. "Yes," I whispered. "It changes everything." He looked at me for a long time, then stepped away, his face unreadable once more. "They'll come for us soon," he said. "For me, for you. You should leave while you still can." I laughed, bitterly, because we both knew I wouldn't. "You think I can walk away now?" "No," he said, his voice low, "but I wish you could." Outside, the sound of engines cut through the night, 3, maybe 4 cars, followed by the distant echo of gunfire somewhere near the gate. Lorenzo turned toward the window, his hand going instinctively to the weapon on his desk, his expression sharpening into something cold and precise. "They're here." The world snapped back into chaos. He looked at me once more, and in his eyes I saw the truth we both already knew, that this was the beginning of the end, that whatever had been set in motion couldn't be undone, that the war he'd warned me about was no longer coming. It had arrived. The night the war came to the house, it did not arrive with warning or mercy. It came like a storm that had been gathering on the horizon for years, and when it broke, it tore through everything. Walls, loyalties, hearts, with the force of inevitability. I remember the first sound. The shatter of glass from the east wing, sharp and small at first, and then the roar of gunfire that followed, a noise so violent it seemed to make the air itself tremble. The lights flickered, the floor shook, and for one suspended heartbeat I didn't breathe. Because that was the moment I knew. Whatever fragile illusion of safety had existed here had just died. Lorenzo was already moving before I could think, his body all precision and purpose, the quiet calm of a man who had lived too many years with danger as a shadow pressed against his back. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm but softer than it should have been. the kind of softness that came not from kindness, but from fear. The fear of losing something he couldn't name. But I followed him anyway, because staying behind while he walked into fire felt worse than facing it myself. The corridors of the mansion had always felt endless, grand in a way that tried to impress rather than comfort. But in that moment they felt like veins filled with panic. The echo of boots and shouted orders and the smell of gunpowder turning every step into a heartbeat counting down. His men were shouting, names, directions, curses, and somewhere beneath it all, I could hear the low hum of engines, the grinding tires of more cars arriving outside. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible above the chaos. He didn't look at me when he answered, eyes fixed on the hallway ahead. "The Ricci family. Matteo's allies. They think killing me will settle the score." "And me?" His gaze flicked to mine for half a second, the faintest trace of something like regret there. Collateral. That single word hit harder than any bullet. We reached the main hall, just as the front doors blew inward, splinters of wood flying like shrapnel, the night outside flashing with gunfire. The men inside responded instantly, the deafening crack of return shots ringing through the marble chamber, sparks of light catching on chandeliers that swayed above like fragile witnesses. I ducked behind a column, the smell of smoke and dust thick in my throat, watching as Lorenzo took command with the ease of someone who'd done this too many times to count. Hand signals, orders barked in Italian, movements sharp and sure. And yet, beneath that ruthless efficiency, I could see the fracture widening, the grief, the rage, the exhaustion that had been waiting for this moment to finally consume him. One of his men fell beside me, a clean shot through the chest, his blood pooling quickly on the polished floor. And I remember thinking how quiet death could be in the middle of such noise. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something. But my body refused to listen, frozen between survival and shock. Then Lorenzo was there, pulling me to my feet, his hand gripping mine so tightly it almost hurt. "We have to move," he said. "They're inside." He led me through a side passage, up a narrow staircase that curved toward the upper floors, and as we climbed, I could hear the building groaning under the weight of battle. Glass breaking, doors slamming, the muffled thud of footsteps that weren't ours. When we reached the landing, he stopped abruptly, pressing his back to the wall, gun raised. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "Listening." The word was barely a sound, but his stillness was absolute. For a heartbeat there was nothing, and then, the sharp metallic click of a safety being released somewhere behind us. Lorenzo spun before I could blink, firing once, twice, 3 times, and a man crumpled at the end of the hall, his weapon clattering to the floor. But before the echo of those shots had faded, another figure stepped out of the shadows, someone older, thinner, his face marked by the kind of scars that don't heal. "Salvatore Ricci," Lorenzo said, his voice low, steady, deadly calm. The man smiled, though it was not a pleasant thing. "Lorenzo De Luca," he replied, "you've been hard to kill." "Try harder," Lorenzo said and fired, but Ricci moved first. The next second was chaos, gunfire, glass breaking, the sound of something heavy falling, and then the dull, wet sound of pain. I didn't even realize Lorenzo had been hit until he stumbled, his hand pressed to his side, blood blooming through the fabric of his shirt like a dark flower. "No!" The word tore from my throat before I could stop it. I ran to him, catching his arm just before he fell, the weight of him heavy and terrifyingly human. He looked at me, his face pale, his breath shallow, and still, he tried to smile. "It's not bad," he lied, his voice thin. Behind us, Ricci laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "He's done, girl. Walk away while you still can." Something inside me snapped then, not the fear, not the grief, but something deeper, fiercer. I reached for the fallen gun, my hands slick with Lorenzo's blood, and before I even knew what I was doing, I fired. The recoil jolted through my body, the sound deafening, and Ricci's laughter cut off instantly as he staggered backward, surprise etched on his face before he fell. The silence that followed was too heavy to bear. I dropped the gun, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and turned back to Lorenzo, who was trying, and failing, to stay upright. "You need a doctor," I said, my voice breaking. "We have to get you out of here." His hand found mine, gripping weakly. "No hospitals," he whispered. "They'd finish what he started." "Then what?" I asked, tears blurring my vision. He managed a faint, humorless smile. "You always ask that." I pressed my hands to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, feeling his pulse flutter beneath my fingers. "Stay with me," I begged. "Please, Lorenzo, don't you dare." He winced, his eyes half closing. "You're still calling me Lorenzo," he murmured. "That's something." "Don't joke," I said, but my voice cracked on the words. His gaze softened then, the faintest trace of warmth breaking through the pain. "If I don't make it, don't," I said sharply. "Don't say that." "If I don't," he continued, "you need to leave this city. There's a file in my office under the floorboard by the fireplace. It has everything. Names, accounts, the proof that will burn them all." "I don't care about proof," I said, tears streaking down my face. "I just want you alive." He smiled again, faintly, his blood staining my hands. "You always wanted truth. Don't stop now." The sound of footsteps echoed from below, more men, more enemies, and I realized we had no time left. I pulled his arm over my shoulders, forcing him to stand, every movement a struggle, every step a prayer whispered through gritted teeth. We made it as far as the stairs before the next explosion hit, the shockwave throwing us both against the wall. Dust rained down, the lights flickered, and somewhere in the distance I heard the sound of sirens, faint but growing. Lorenzo coughed, blood on his lips, and looked at me, eyes burning even through the pain. "Go," he said again. "I'm not leaving you," I said. He laughed then, a broken, desperate sound, and whispered, "Stubborn to the end." The floor trembled beneath us, another blast somewhere outside, and I knew we were out of time. I turned toward him, ready to drag him the rest of the way if I had to. But then I saw it. The figure at the bottom of the stairs, gun raised, face hidden by the shadows. There was no warning, just the flash of light, the sound of another shot, and the sudden warmth of his blood on my skin. He fell against me, heavy, breath leaving him in a shudder. And as I screamed his name, the world went dark. When I woke, the world was blurred, the edges of everything soft and unsteady, as though reality itself was trying to forget what had happened. But the scent of smoke and blood refused to fade, and the weight of his name on my tongue reminded me that forgetting was a luxury I would never have again. For a moment I thought I was dead, that this hazy, half-lit place was some strange purgatory where the noise of violence had finally gone silent. But then pain bloomed sharp and alive along my arm, and the sound of distant voices broke through the fog. Someone had dragged me out of the mansion. I could taste dust in the air, feel cold night wind on my face. The city was far away, but its glow flickered faintly on the horizon, distant and unreachable, like a world that no longer belonged to me. I tried to sit up, and the memory came rushing back. The gunfire, the blast, Lorenzo falling against me, his blood warm and real, the sound of his breath fading. My heart seized, and for a terrible moment I couldn't breathe at all. He was gone. The thought sliced through me with a clean, merciless edge, and the scream that rose in my chest never made it, past my lips. I wanted to run back, to claw through the rubble to find him no matter what was left. But the men who had pulled me from the wreckage, Lorenzo's men, I realized dimly, held me down, their faces drawn with a kind of broken loyalty that mirrored my own. "Boss said if anything happened," one of them murmured, his voice shaking. We take you out, make sure you live." "He's dead," I whispered. The man shook his head once, eyes down. "We don't know." "Not yet." But I did. Somewhere deep inside I already knew, because something inside me had gone quiet. A silence that wasn't peace but absence, the way the air feels after a fire burns itself out. The next few days blurred together like smoke through glass. I barely remembered the safe house they took me to, or the way time stretched and folded in on itself, each hour heavy with waiting and disbelief. The news reports called it an explosion at a private estate. Possible gang retaliation. No survivors confirmed. The words sterile and hollow compared to what I had seen. I couldn't bring myself to read the rest. But grief is a strange creature. It doesn't just sit quietly and mourn. It searches, claws, refuses, and I couldn't let it rest. So I went back. The mansion was gone, or almost gone, its bones still standing in jagged silhouettes against the pale morning sky. The air smelled of ash and iron, and every step I took crunched over glass and memory. I walked through what was left of the study, the walls blackened, the desk shattered, and beneath a half-collapsed beam I saw it, the faint glint of metal, the floorboard by the fireplace, the one he'd told me about. It took everything I had to move the debris, my hands scraped and bleeding, but finally I pulled it free. A small steel box, soot-stained but intact. Inside were papers, hard drives, photographs, proof of everything. Every deal, every politician, every name that had bought their silence with blood. And in the middle of it all, folded carefully, a note addressed to me. Elena. If you're reading this, it means the war finally found me. Maybe I should have run when I had the chance, but I never was good at walking away from things that burned. You once told me you wanted the truth. This is it. Everything you need to destroy them. Every name. Every sin. Use it. Burn it. Do what I couldn't. And if somehow I survive this, if by some miracle you still have room in your heart to look at me without hate, then find me where the light touches the water. L. My hands shook so hard the paper nearly slipped from my fingers. It was impossible, absurd, some dying man's poetic farewell. But the words "if I survive this" kept echoing in my head, louder than reason. The sea. It had to mean the old De Luca docks, the private pier where he used to keep his boats, the same place where I'd once seen him standing under the stars, quiet and untouchable. I didn't think, didn't pack, didn't breathe, I just ran. The city blurred past, the streets slick with rain, headlights carving through fog like ghosts. By the time I reached the water, dawn was breaking again, pale light spilling across the waves, soft and cruel and endless. For a long moment I saw nothing but the tide moving in slow, deliberate rhythm, the docks stretching empty and broken, and the hopelessness hit me like a blow. He wasn't here. Of course he wasn't. I sank to my knees, the wood cold and damp beneath me, the letter clutched to my chest, and I whispered his name into the wind, because saying it out loud was the only proof I had left that it had ever been real. But then, just as the sun lifted above the horizon, I saw movement near the edge of the pier. A figure, unsteady but real, walking slowly toward me. For a second I thought my mind had finally broken under the weight of what I'd lost, that I was seeing ghosts, that grief had conjured him out of air and memory. But then he spoke, and the sound of his voice, hoarse, quiet, unmistakably alive, cut through the morning like salvation. "You never listen," he said. "I told you to leave." I turned, and there he was, Lorenzo, alive, barely, his arm bound in rough bandages, his clothes torn and blood-stained, his face pale, but his eyes, those impossible gray eyes, still sharp, still burning. He looked older, fragile in a way I'd never seen, but alive. I ran to him, my legs trembling, and when I reached him I hit his chest with both hands, half sobbing, half laughing. "You're supposed to be dead," I said, and my voice cracked on the words. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried every scar he'd ever earned. I almost was. Why didn't you tell me? Because you'd have stayed, he said softly. And I couldn't let you die for me. I stared at him, the anger and love and grief colliding inside me until it was impossible to separate them. You idiot, I whispered. You're bleeding. So are you, he said, brushing his thumb over the cut on my arm, and somehow we both laughed, broken and breathless and alive. For a long moment we just stood there, the water below us whispering against the docks, the sky opening wider above. Around us, the city was waking up again, indifferent to our survival, the rest of the world already moving on. But for us, time had stopped. What now? I asked finally. He looked out at the horizon, the wind tugging at his hair, and said, Now we finish what we started. You have the proof. You can burn them all. And you? He smiled, tired and beautiful. Maybe I'll finally learn how to live without burning everything I touch. I reached up, touched his face gently, tracing the line of his jaw, the stubble, the faint scar that would always remind me how close I'd come to losing him. You won't, I said. That's not who you are. He caught my hand, pressed it to his lips, his breath warm against my skin. Then maybe you'll have to teach me. The waves below us were endless, the sun bright now, painting everything gold. And as I looked at him, this man who had been my captor, my enemy, my impossible salvation, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a gift you give someone else. It was the fire you walk through to save yourself. Because love, in the end, is not the opposite of darkness. It's the light that chooses to stay anyway. And as we stood there, two broken pieces of something that had somehow survived, I understood that the war was over. Not because we had won, but because we had stopped fighting each other long enough to see what was left. He looked at me, eyes softer now, and said, You ruined my empire. I smiled, tears slipping down my cheeks. Then let's build something better. The wind carried our laughter out over the water, blending with the sound of the tide, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like running or fighting or breaking. I just felt free.